Hello everyone. Today we begin with a touching story about an Apache man who lost his voice after the war and lived alone in the wide deserts of New Mexico until the day he saved a lost mother and her 2 children. Between them grew a quiet love, one that healed the pain of the past and helped him find his voice again, not just in words, but through his heart. So before we begin this journey together, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm sharing. And don't forget to let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. It's always wonderful to know we have friends listening from all around the world. And now let's begin the story. Snow never touched this land, but cold could still live here, hidden in the wind that swept across the red desert and whispered through the brittle mesquite. For 5 years, Nanton had lived with that wind. He built his days out of silence, hunting jackrabbits at dawn, mending traps at dusk, whispering no prayers. Though he still poured a cup of water onto the soil each morning, that was his only ritual. In Apache belief, water returned the world's breath to the earth. He'd taken enough of it once he owed it back. The war had ended for others, but not for him. Out here, far from any fort or settlement, he could almost believe the world had forgotten his name. The army coat he wore hung in rags, a reminder of the time he had served men who spoke of peace while burning villages. The scar at his throat, it still ached when the wind turned dry. It had stolen his voice as surely as the war had stolen his people. He didn't speak because there were no words worth saying. That morning, the sun rose like an ember behind the mountains. Nanton knelt by his small corral, checking the mule's hoof, when he noticed something strange. A faint groove in the sand, a broken wheel track. He followed it along a narrow arroyo until the air began to smell of sweat and iron. Then he sorted a wagon tipped on its side. One wheel shattered, canvas torn open by bullets. A dead horse sprawled in the sand. Flies already claimed it. He approached quietly, rifle ready, though he expected no living thing. But then soft, uneven breathing. A woman's voice, raw with thirst, whispering, "Please, please." Inside the wreck lay 3 figures. A woman slumped over 2 small bodies, her dress the color of dust. Her hair, light brown, star with gray, stuck to her face with dried blood. The boy and girl beneath her clung to each other, still breathing, but limp from exhaustion. A canteen lay nearby, empty. For a long moment he only stared. Then something in him older than guilt, older than silence, moved his body forward. He gave them water first, only a sip each from his own skin pouch. The woman's lips trembled as she drank. The boy coughed weakly. The girl's small hand found his wrist and didn't let go. When he tried to lift the woman, she jerked awake. Her eyes went wide, pale and frightened, and for an instant he saw himself reflected in them. Dark skin, scarred neck, hair braided Apache style. She pushed at him, voice, "Don't you touch them." "Don't." He stepped back, hands open, showing he carried no weapon. He pointed toward the horizon, the direction of shelter, and then toward the sky. Storm clouds were gathering from the south. She blinked, uncomprehending, then sagged. Her strength was gone. He carried the children first, one under each arm, light as empty sacks. Then he returned for the woman. She tried to resist, but her body gave up before her fear did. He set her across the mule and led them through the rising wind. The journey back took 2 hours. Sand stung like knives. By the time his small hut came into view, the sun had vanished behind a wall of dust. He got them inside, laid the children on his bedding, covered them with blankets made from old cavalry coats. The woman shivered violently. He gave her the last of his firewood. When she opened her eyes again, the light of the fire showed her rescuer clearly. He was tall, lean, skinned like old copper. His hair hung to his shoulders, stray with ash. The left side of his neck bore a scar like a knife's memory. And he said nothing, only moved with calm, deliberate purpose. He boiled water, tore strips from a clean shirt to bind her arm, then set a tin cup in her hand. She stared, still trembling. "You're Apache," she whispered, as if naming a ghost. He didn't answer, didn't even nod. His eyes met hers for a heartbeat, steady, unreadable, and then drifted away. The children woke near midnight. The boy sat up first, panicked until he saw his mother alive beside the fire. The girl pointed toward Nan, who sat just outside the doorframe watching the storm. "Who's he?" she asked. Her mother hesitated. "Someone who helped us." The boy frowned. He doesn't talk? No, she said softly. He doesn't. The wind beat against the walls like distant drums. Nanton remained outside until the storm died, then walked down to the wash to refill his water skins. The stars reappeared, sharp and cold. He looked up at them, the same stars that had watched the fire in his village years ago, and wondered if silence itself could be a kind of punishment handed down from heaven. By morning the desert lay washed clean, all tracks erased. The woman stepped outside the hut, squinting at the bright horizon. Her name, he learned later from a letter that had fallen from her satchel, was Evelyn Carter. Her husband's name was written beneath the soldier, dead 2 winters past. The children, William and Clara Evelyn, found Nanton already awake, tending a small fire near a pot of boiling water. She tried to speak, then stopped, uncertain whether he would understand. "Thank you," she managed. "For last night." He turned his head slightly, acknowledging her words, then poured hot water into a tin cup and handed it to her. Steam rose between them. When she reached for the cup, their fingers brushed just an instant, and she felt the roughness of his skin, the heat beneath it. Not fear this time, but something stranger, a pulse of gratitude, a question unspoken. He pointed toward the horizon again, drawing shapes in the sand with a stick. She realized he was telling her the road was broken, the wagon useless. They would need days to mend it. Her jaw tightened. She had never planned for delay. Yet his quiet certainty, the way he measured each gesture, made it hard to argue. "Then we stay," she said at last. He nodded once, then went to gather mesquite branches for the fire. That night, the desert cooled fast. The air inside the hut smelled of smoke and damp wool. Evelyn tucked her children under blankets and watched Nanton sit by the door, sharpening a knife, his face half lit by the flames. Every movement of his hands seemed practiced, almost ceremonial. He was a man built of control, one who had learned that words often failed where silence could endure. She wanted to ask him who he was, what had stolen his voice, why he lived alone out here, but something about the stillness between them felt sacred. Sacred not to be disturbed. Outside the wind shifted, carrying the faint howl of a coyote across the dunes. Clara stirred, whispering, "Mama, why doesn't he talk?" Evelyn brushed her daughter's hair and smiled faintly. "Maybe he's listening," she said. Nanton heard it through the crack in the door. He didn't turn, but a small breath escaped him. Half a sigh, half a sound long forgotten. For the first time in years, the silence inside him felt less like a prison and more like a waiting place, where someone might one day speak his name again. The days settled into a strange rhythm beneath the pale desert sky by morning light spilled over the dry hills, turning everything the color of old bone. The wind never truly rested. It moved through the canyons like an unseen hand, brushing against the cabin walls, whispering over the roof. Evelyn had meant to stay only long enough for her strength to return, but the wagon's wheel was splintered clean through, the horse dead, and her boy's arm badly bruised. Even if she could have walked to the next settlement, there was the question of food, water, and the road itself, washed away by the last sponsor. So she stayed. The Apache man, she still called him that in her mind, worked without needing words. He fixed what he could, mended the harness, split wood with a steady rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. When he moved, the air around him seemed to quiet. Her children watched him from a cautious distance at first. William's eyes followed every gesture, waiting for something sudden or violent. Clara, less afraid, began leaving small offerings on the table near his corner. A piece of bread, a wildflower, a button she found in the dust. He never took them in front of her, but they were always gone by morning. It took 3 days before Evelyn found her courage to speak first. "I don't know what to call you," she said one evening, while he stirred the small pot of stew over the fire. "You've done so much for us, but I can't just keep saying Apache." He glanced up. The firelight caught the edge of his scar, making it shine pale against his skin. He looked toward the floor, then picked up a small stick and began to draw in the dirt near the hearth. When he finished, she bent closer to read it. "No." Her lips moved as she sounded it out. "Nanton." He nodded one, eyes lifting to hers. "What does it mean?" she asked. He hesitated, then drew another mark simpler this time. A small circle with lines coming out from it like a voice radiating. She realized then, "Speaker," she whispered. His mouth twitched almost a smile, though his eyes stayed distant. A man named Speaker, who could not speak. She wanted to ask more, but something about that irony felt too sad to touch. The days grew warmer. They found a rhythm together, odd, wordless, but almost peaceful. Evelyn baked cornmeal cakes on the iron PE while he repaired the wagon's axle. He showed William how to tie rope in a way that would hold through a windstorm. Clara followed him, like a small shadow, fascinated by the quiet way he marved. One afternoon, while gathering mesquite pods for the fire, Evelyn came upon Nanton crouched near the arroyo, tracing patterns in the sand. They looked like rivers branching toward a central pool. He used a stick to point toward the distant cliffs. She realized he was showing her where the underground springs ran, how he found water in this barren place. He broke a twig, pressed it into her palm, and then motioned for her to follow. 10 minutes later, they reached a shallow hollow where the sand was damp beneath a layer of stone. He dug with his hands until water began to seep through. She laughed, startled by joy. "You found it." He looked up at her laughter as though hearing something stir it. For an instant, the corners of his mouth softened. It wasn't quite a smile, but close enough to make her heart stumble. That night, the wind picked up again. Fine dust blew through the cracks in the door. Evelyn stuffed rags along the threshold, while Nanton carried the children's bedding to the far corner, away from the draft. The fire flared and smoked, painting the walls orange. The storm grew stronger, moaning across the roof like a chorus of ghosts. Evelyn sat with the children, their faces pressed against her skirt. Non moved to the door, bracing it with his shoulder, holding it shut against the guests. When the roof began to rattle, Evelyn panicked and rushed to help him. She pressed her hand against the door beside his, feeling the force of the wind. They stood shoulder to shoulder, close enough that she could smell the dry leather of his coat, the faint scent of smoke clinging to his hair. After a long while, the wind died. The silence that followed was deep, almost holy. Nanton turned slightly. The lantern light revealed the white scar along his throat, ugly and puckered. Evelyn's gaze caught there before she could look away. Without thinking, she reached up, fingers trembling, and touched the edge of it. He froze. For a heartbeat, she thought he might step back, but he didn't. His eyes met her as dark, steady, unreadable, and then silent, just enough to let her hand linger. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have." He shook his head just once. Then he moved away back to the fire, as if to spare her embarrassment. Yet she could feel the echo of that small moment, the warmth of skin beneath her fingertips, long after he sat down again. By morning the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. The sky was a hard blue, the kind that stretched forever. William went outside to fetch water and managed to drop one of Nanton's clay bowls, shattering it on the stone. The sound cracked like a gunshot. The boy froze. I'm sorry," he stammered, backing up. Nanton turned from the corral. For a moment, his face was unreadable. Then he crouched beside the broken piece, gathering them one by one. He set them in a neat pile, brushed the dust from his hands, and placed a reassuring hand on William's shoulder before walking away. The boy stood still, stunned by the gentleness. When he came back inside, his voice was small. He didn't even get mad. Evelyn smiled faintly. He's not the kind that breaks easy. And later that afternoon, while Nanton worked on carving a new bowl, from wood, Evelyn sat outside sewing the hem of Clara's dress. She found herself studying him as he worked the precision of his movements, the patience in his hands. He never rushed. Every cut was measured, deliberate, as though even the smallest task deserved respect. "You're a quiet one, Mr. Nanton," she murmured half to herself. Maybe the world would be kinder if more men were. He didn't look up, but the faintest breath of laughter escaped him. A sound so soft she almost missed it. That night, as they all ate together, she caught William sneaking glances at the Apache, trying to imitate the way he held his spoon. Clara offered him a wild flower she'd picked from near the spring, pressing it into his palm. He looked at it for a long moment before tucking it carefully behind a beam above the fire. Evelyn watched that small act and felt something shift inside her. It wasn't quite love. Not yet. But it was unknowing, the sense that this quiet man who carried his grief like a second shadow had brought peace to her house without ever saying a word. When she finally lay down beside her sleeping children, the desert was still. Only the faint crackle of the dying fire filled the night. Through the half-open door she could see Nanton outside, sitting by the coals, head bowed as if in prayer. The wind whispered again, softer this time, carrying with it a trace of coolness that smelled like rain. She closed her eyes and thought, maybe silence isn't emptiness. Maybe it is what comes before the first true word. Spring crept over the desert. The way dawn spills over the mountains, slow, uncertain, but impossible to stop. Tiny green shoots rose between the rocks where the floods had passed, and the wind carried the smell of wet earth for the first time in months. For Evelyn, the change felt almost like grace. It had been more than 5 weeks since the night of the sandstorm. The wagon was nearly mended now. They could have left, perhaps should have, but each morning brought another reason to wait one more board to patch, one more day to rest the mule, one more quiet evening when the children laughed without fear. And there was none. He spoke no words, but filled the silence with small acts that said enough. When the sun rose, he was already up stoking the fire. He fixed the shutter that banged in the wind, oiled the hinges, repaired the soles of William's boots with sinew thread. He seemed to know what needed doing before anyone asked. Evelyn tried not to think of what it would be like when they finally left him behind. Clara adored him now. She followed him everywhere, her small feet padding across the dust, asking questions he could not answer. Still, she chatted on, and somehow his silence never made her feel ignored. Sometimes he drew pictures in the sand for her bird's dear. Once, even the outline of a house, she decided that meant he wanted to build one. William had taken longer. The boy still guarded his pride, still watched Nanton with the weary eyes of someone raised on half-truths about starbursts. But the day Nanton taught him how to track quail through the brush, that wall began to crumble. "See?" Evelyn said quietly. That evening, watching through the doorway as the boy followed the Apache's gestures, mimicking his crouch, he's learning without a single word spoken. Nanton's patience with the children unsettled her sometimes. She'd known soldiers, ranchers, merchants, but none of them moved with such deliberate gentleness. It was as if the violence of his past had burned out everything reckless in him. One night, after the children had fallen asleep, she sat at the small table writing in her weather-worn journal the first time she'd written since her husband's death. Her pen trembled as she began. "I don't know why I trust him. Maybe because he never demands it. He carries himself like a man listening to something the rest of us can't hear. Pelance doesn't seem to weigh on him. It protects him like the desert protects its secrets." She stopped there, realizing her heart was moving faster than her hand. The next day, near noon, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. At first, she thought it was a storm, but the glint of sunlight off metal gave its shape a rider. Nanton noticed at the same moment, he. That evening she cooked more stew than they needed. He ate in silence while the children whispered and watched, unsure why their mother's eyes looked red. After supper, Clara climbed into his lap without asking. She held out a torn scrap of paper and a bit of charcoal. "You can draw, can't you? Draw us." He looked at her, then at Evelyn. The woman nodded faintly. Nanton began to sketch on the paper. Rough lines, but sure. When he finished, Clara clapped her hands. It was all 4 of them, the 2 children, Alan by the fire and himself beside them. "It's us," Clara said proudly. "Our family." Evelyn started to correct her, then stopped. The word caught in her throat. Later that night, when the children slept, she found him sitting outside again, staring at the stars. She joined him without speaking. The air smelled of mesquite smoke and distant rain. "I don't judge you," she said at last softly. "You did what you were told. We all have ghosts." He turned his head slightly, eyes reflecting the firelight. For the first time, he let himself look at her. Really look. And though he said nothing, she felt the weight in that gaze as heavy as any words could be. She smiled through the ache in her chest. "Maybe tomorrow we start again." He nodded once, a movement so small it could have been mistaken for breathing. In the stillness, the night seemed to listen with them. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called, its cry long and lonely, fading into silence. And for the first time since that day, by the wagon. Evelyn didn't feel afraid of the quiet. The sun burned higher each day, bleaching the horizon until the land seemed to shimmer like glass. The spring rains had come and gone, leaving only a faint trace of green around the waterhole. Evelyn had begun packing again. The wagon wheel was mended, the mules strong enough to travel. Each morning she told herself they'd leave by dusk. And each dusk she found a reason to wait Nanton. Fixing the last strafey, Clara running fever from the heat, William begging for one more day. But deep down she knew staying any longer would blur the lines between what was safe and what was already too dear. That afternoon she stood outside folding blankets, the drywall wind catching at her hair. Nan was by the corral tightening the cinch on the mule's saddle. His movements were slower lately, as though something unspoken pressed on both of them. "You've done enough," she said quietly. "You don't have to help anymore." He looked at her steady, unreadable. Then he picked up the rope she dropped and tied it neatly to the wagon rail. "I mean it," she said. "You've given us a place to rest."
"I can't repay that."
He held her gaze for a long moment, then simply nodded and turned away. That night, while the children slept, she sat by the small fire with her journal open but unwritten. The air between them had thickened with something she didn't know how to name. She finally tore a piece of cloth from her old apron and began to stitch a few words into it with rough thread. "You gave us safety. I hope you find peace." When she was done, she folded it into his hand as he sat by the door, eyes fixed on the stars. He looked down at the cloth, then up at her, question in his eyes. She smiled, though her throat ached. "We'll leave at first light." For a long time he didn't move. Then very slowly he touched the edge of the cloth to his forehead, a gesture she didn't understand, but it felt like a farewell. The next morning, the sky was heavy with dark clouds gathering from the south. Thunder rolled far away, low and hollow. Non stood beside the mule as Evelyn lifted the children into the wagon. William gripped his arm hard before letting go. "Thank you," the boy said. Clara waved from the seat. "Goodbye, Mr. Nanton." He raised his hand, palm open. Evelyn looked down at him, trying to memorize the lines of his face, the quiet strength of it, the scar that no longer frightened her. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. He nodded once. Then she flicked the reins and the wagon rolled forward, creaking toward the open desert. She didn't look back until the cabin was a small blur behind them. By midday, thunder had drawn closer. The desert darkened to the color of steel. Rain fell in wide, lazy drops that quickly turned into sheets. Evelyn urged the mule faster, but the road dissolved into mud. That was when she saw them, 3 riders cresting the ridge behind, black shapes against the gray sky. Her heart slammed in her chest. She knew those faces as even from a distance, the same men who had attacked their wagon weeks ago. "Get down," she shouted to the children, pulling the rifle from the seat. A gun cracked. The mule screamed, stumbling. The wagon lurched to one side, throwing William against the rail. One of the riders, a broad man with a scarred cheek, spurred closer, shouting over the rain. "Hand over the wagon, woman. You and the brats can go free." Evelyn fired once, the shot going wide. The recoil stung her shoulder. She tried again, but the rifle jammed. Another rider circled to the flank, airing thought. A bullet splintered the wagon frame. Clara screamed. William grabbed the reins, pulling hard to keep the mule steady. Then through the curtain of rain she saw movement dark fast. Coming from the ridge behind the riders, a figure on foot. Non. He moved through the downpour like a shadow, bow in hand. Arrows slung across his back. The first arrow flew before the men even noticed. It struck the lead rider's arm, spinning him sideways in the saddle. The second hit the ground near the horse's legs, spooking it into a rear. The third man turned his gun toward the ridge, but by then, Nanton was already there, silent as the storm itself. What followed blurred in the rain and thunder. Gunshots echoed, horses screamed. Alan saw flashes of movement. Nanton tackling one rider into the mud, disarming another with a blow from his bow. A knife flashed. Someone shouted, then counts again. When the last man fled into the distance, the storm swallowed him whole. Evelyn ran to where Nanton had fallen near the wagon. Blood darkened his sleeve, soaking through to his chest. He tried to sit up, but she caught him. "Don't you dare!" she whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare leave me now." The rain poured over them, mixing red and brown and silver. The children knelt beside her, frying. William pressed his small hands against Nanton's wound, desperate to help. Evelyn tore strips from her skirt, pressing them to his shoulder. He didn't flinch. His eyes, half open, searched hers. "I should have known you'd follow us," she said, tears streaking her cheeks. "You stubborn, quiet man." He tried to speak, but only a rasp came. She shook her head. "Hush." "Save your strength!" He lifted one trembling hand and touched her face, thumb brushing a tear away. The rain came harder, washing the blood from his fingers. The sound of it filled the world water over ash, over wounds that ran deeper than skin. By the time she got him back to the cabin, the storm had passed. The desert smelled of life again. Evelyn built a fire, tore her blanket to bind the wound, and set the children to heating water. Danton's breathing was shallow but steady. She stayed beside him through the night, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Once he stirred, eyes half open. "You rest," she whispered. "You saved us again. You always do." He looked at her, the faintest ghost of a smile in his eyes. Outside, the rainwater gathered in the small arroyo behind the cabin, forming a thin stream that glimmered under the moonlight. Evelyn could hear it trickling softly, the first running water she'd heard in months. She leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes, tears mixing with exhaustion. "Don't leave me," she murmured again, though he was already asleep. "Please don't." And somewhere between the sound of water and wind, she thought she heard an answer, not in words, but in the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. For 3 days and 3 nights, the desert slept beneath the hush of rain. The earth drank deeply, and the air turned cool with the smell of wet sage. Inside the cabin, a different kind of silence filled the room, not the hollow kind that once haunted it, but a waiting silence heavy with breath and heartbeat. Nanton lay still on the cot, his shoulder bound in white cloth. The fever came and went, making him drift between darkness and dream. Sometimes he saw fire and the shadow of his brother's face. Sometimes he saw Evelyn kneeling beside him, her hair undone, eyes full of worry that looked too much like prayer. Evelyn hadn't left his side. She spooned him water, wiped his brow, whispered words he could not answer. The children brought wood, kept the fire alive, and watched their mother with quail. They'd never seen her so fierce, so alive in her care. On the 4th morning, when the light slipped through the cracks in the roof, Nanton opened his eyes fully. His gaze found her at once. She sat at the small table, writing in her journal again, her back straight, though she'd slept little. He tried to move, but pain bloomed through his chest. She turned at the sound of his breath. "You're awake," she said, smiling through her exhaustion. "Thank God." He blinked, tried to speak, but the sound that came was only a rasp. Air without shape. She was beside him in a heartbeat. "Don't," she murmured. "Not yet." "You don't have to." He looked at her face lined with worry, stree with ash from nights of tending the fire, and something in him broke open. For years his silence had been a wall, a penance. Now seeing her, it felt like a chain he no longer needed. She reached out, took his hand. "You saved us again. Why?" He met her eyes, wanting to tell her everything. The guilt, the ghosts, the sound of his people dying in the smoke. But the words wouldn't come. He lifted his free hand, pressed it to his chest, then pointed to her, to the children. She understood enough. Tears welled. "Then let me save you too," she whispered. That evening the fever returned, fierce and burning. He tossed in half-sleep, caught between the world of the living and the echoes of his past. He saw again the village of his childhood, flames licking the scaly women running, his brother's voice crying his name. He saw himself wearing the army coat, leading soldiers through the canyon, believing their promise of peace. He saw the moment he realized the lie too late, too far. The memory had stolen his voice before. Now it clawed back, raw and bright. He woke gasping, drenched in sweat. Evelyn was there, wiping his face with a damp cloth. The children slept in the corner, curled together under a blanket. Her eyes met his. "You're safe," she said. He tried again. The first sound that came was broken, just air and pain, but he didn't stop. He touched his throat, forcing the sound into shape, one syllable at a time. His voice cracked like a branch in dry wind. "Love." She froze. He swallowed. Tried again. Weaker but clearer, "You." Evelyn's hand trembled. She pressed it to her lips as though afraid to breathe. "Say it again," she whispered. He did slower, each word costing him breath. "I love you." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she leaned forward, tears spilling freely, and kissed his forehead. "You don't know what that means to me," she said. "You've just given me back something I thought I'd lost forever." He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of her hand on his cheek, and for the first time in years, sleep came without the taste of ash. When dawn arrived, the world outside glittered with life. Puddles shone like mirrors. Birds returned to the air, their calls sharp and joyous. Nanton could stand again within a week, his arms still stiff but strong enough to lift the small water bucket. He practiced speaking softly, shaping simple words. Water, sun, clarai. The children delighted in every success. William laughed the first time he heard his name spoken aloud. Clara clapped her hands and shouted, "Say it again." He smiled shilly, repeating the name. Clara. Evelyn listened from the doorway, heart swelling at the sound of his voice. It was low and rough, but carried a steadiness that made her think of river stones. Sometimes he lost a word, paused mid-sentence, frustration clouding his face. She would lay her hand over his and whisper, "It's all right. You're learning to breathe again." He'd smile then, small, fleeting, but enough to light the room. One night when the children were asleep, they sat by the fire together. The flames cast long shadows across the floor. Nanton's voice came haltingly. But sure, he told her in pieces about the war, about the day he was promised peace for his people, only to lead soldiers into his own brother's village. How the screams had swallowed his voice, how he had fled into the desert to wait for death. But the land refused to take him. Evelyn didn't interrupt. She listened, tears shining but unshed. When he finished, the sealants between them was heavy and clean like the air after rain. She reached out, brushed her fingers along his scar. "You think the earth won't forgive you," she said quietly. "But it already has. You are still here," he bowed his head. "Still's here," he echoed, the words slow but steady. She smiled, and not alone. For a long while they just sat there, the sound of the fire filling the room. He leaned forward then, hesitating. She met him halfway. Their lips touched softly at first, like two people remembering what it meant to live. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his. "We're not ghosts anymore," she whispered. He nodded, his breath brushing her cheek. "Alive," he said, and the word came easier this time, sure and whole. The following week, life returned to something like normal. Evelyn reopened her plans to move on, but this time, she thought not of leaving Nanton, but of building beside him. He taught William how to repair the roof, how to carve a small bow. Clara learned to braid her hair with wild flowers, like the Apache women she'd seen in old drawings. One evening, as they gathered for supper, Clara looked at Nanton and asked, "You can talk again, can't you?" He smiled at her, nodding. "Then will you sing?" she said. "Mama sings sometimes when she sews." He hesitated. Then slowly he began to hum not a song with words but a low rhythmic tune that seemed to come from the earth itself. The children listened wide-eyed. Evelyn felt tears prick her throat again. It wasn't a song of sorrow. It was something older, deeper, a sound that held both mourning and hope. When he stopped, the quiet that followed felt sacred. Alan reached across the table, taking his hand. "You have your voice again," she said softly. He met her eyes. "You," he replied, his voice still rough but sure, gave it back. Outside, the desert wind shifted, carrying the scent of new rain from the south. For the first time, he didn't flinch at the sound it no longer echoed with ghosts. It was just the wind moving over living things. By the time summer ripened, the desert had changed its skin. Where once the ground had cracked and bled dust, shoots of corn and beans now pushed through, stubborn and green. The small stream behind the cabin ran clear, singing softly over stones Non had carried there by hand. It had been almost a year since the storm, the night he bled beneath the rain, the night she refused to let him die. Now the cabin was not a refuge for wanderers, but a home. The scent of wood smoke and bread drifted from its open windows. A crude fence circled the garden. Chickens scratched near the porridge, and laughter, real laughter, moved through the air like wind through wheat. Evelyn stood near the doorway, her hands dusted with flour, watching William and Clara chase each other in the yard. Nanton was repairing the fence, sleeves rolled up, his scar pale against the bronze of his neck. Every so often he looked toward her, a small smile ghosting across his face before returning to his work. She still marveled at the sound of his voice when he spoke low and careful, each word deliberate, as if language were sacred. He didn't speak much, but when he did, every syllable carried weight. That evening, as the sky went gold, she joined him by the half-built section of the fence. "You've turned this land into something living," she said. He set down the hammer, wiped his brow with his forearm. "It was already alive," he said. His voice was soft but steady now, just waiting to be forgiven. She smiled, brushing sawdust from his sleeve. "Like you." He looked at her then, and the smile reached his eyes. "Like us," he corrected gently. The children had started calling him without anyone's permission. It happened one morning when William, frustrated with his schoolwork, threw his slate down and muttered, "Pa would have known this." Nanton had turned, startled, not sure he'd heard right. "Evelyn Fisi," watching from across the room. The boy looked up, realizing what he'd said. His cheeks flushed. "I mean you. I meant you." For a moment Nan didn't move. Then slowly he nodded, his face unreadable, except for the faint shine in his eyes. "Then I will try," he said quietly. From that day William followed him like a shadow. He learned to shape arrowheads, to mend a saddle, to read the weather by the tilt of the clouds. Clara, meanwhile, filled the house with sketches and flowers, her laughter softening every corner. She often sat by Nanton while he carved, humming tunes she'd learned from her mother. Sometimes he hummed along, the old Apache melody weaving with her child's song until the two became one. Evelyn would watch them and feel something bloom in her chest that she had thought long dead, a peace that asked for nothing but to last. By late summer, the land began to hum with work. Evelyn opened a small school under the cottonwood tree that shaded the stream. At first, only a handful of children came, curious sons and daughters of ranchers who had heard stories about the widow and her Indian. Their parents disapproved. She saw the glances in town when she went to trade for supplies. The whispers followed her like dust, but she held her head high. When asked where she lived, she answered plainly, "With my husband, Nanton, and our children." Some turned away, others nodded slowly, something thoughtful in their eyes. It was Reverend Stone who broke the silence first. He came one Sunday, hat in hand, his weathered face serious. "Mrs. Carter," he began, "there's talk. Folks wondering why you won't come back to town to church. Some say you've forgotten your own kind." Evelyn met his gaze squarely. "I remember my kind just fine," she said. "They are the ones who helped me survive a winter, not the ones who turned away." The old preacher studied her for a long moment. Then he sighed, tipping his hat. "You've got more faith in your silence than most have in their prayers." When he rode away, she felt something lift from her shoulders. Autumn came soft and golden. The air smelled of corn husks and woods. The stream that had once been a trickle now ran sure and bright. Nanton had dug a channel to lead the water into the garden. One evening, Evelyn found him stacking stones on a hill just beyond the cottonwood. The children were asleep, their soft breathing filling the cabin. She climbed the slope to where he stood. The sun was sinking, painting the world in red and copper. "What are you building?" she asked. He looked down at the small car of stones, then at her. In his hand, he held two objects, his brother's necklace of bone and Clara's woven bracelet. "I carry them too long," he said. "They belong to the earth now." He knelt, placing the necklace and bracelet beneath the top stone. When he rose, she saw peace in his face, a calm she hadn't seen before. "Why here?" she asked softly. He glanced at the horizon. "So peace has roots too," he said. The words lingered in the cooling air like a blessing. That winter was kind. No storms came. Only the slow rhythm of life, chopping wood, teaching lessons, tending the garden's dry stalks. Sometimes Evelyn still wrote in her journal by lamplight, the sound of Nanton's quiet breathing behind her. Her last entry of that year read, "He once spoke only in silence. Now his words grow like the water, slow, steadfast, alive." She set the journal aside, walked to the doorway, and looked out at the land that had become their world. The cottonwood rustled softly in the night wind. The stream whispered its endless song. Nan stood near the water's edge, looking up at the stars. She joined him, slipping her hand into his. He turned to her, eyes reflecting the silver sky. "Thank you," he said, voice steady now, rich as the earth beneath them. "For finding me," Evelyn smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "We found each other." Behind them in the cabin, William stirred and mumbled in his sleep, calling for pay. Clara's small laughter followed, dreaming of something bright. The world was quiet again, not the silence of grief, but of peace. Under the cottonwood, the cairn of stone stood firm, and from its species the first shoots of green grass began to grow, fed by the water that flowed beneath the soil. When spring returned, the stream swelled with snowmelt from the mountains. The fields shimmered with new growth. Evelyn and Nanton worked side by side, planting seeds, their hands touching now and then in the cool earth. "Do you think it'll last?" she asked one afternoon, looking at the endless sky. He smiled faintly, squinting against the light. "Nothing lasts," he said, "but everything begins again." She looked at him, then really looked at the scar that no longer seemed to wound, at the calm strength in his eyes, and nodded. "Then let it begin." Together they planted the last row. The water glinted nearby, winding its way toward the cottonwood and the cairn, carrying whispers of all that had been lost and all that had been found. The land breathed again, and beneath the vast western sky, two lives once broken had become whole where the water flowed. Thank you for listening to this story. Your time, your presence, and your heart mean more than you know. If the story touched you, please share it with someone who might need a moment of peace and hope today.